It's Carolyn Grimm with Nonprofit Financial Mastery. I'm here today to talk about one of the most important financial power tools that a nonprofit has, and that is the budget. So let's talk about the essentials. So, what is a budget? It is a financial roadmap. That's all it is. It's a financial roadmap. There's a lot of negative kind of feelings that people get about budgets, but what we're doing when we create a budget is we create a financial roadmap, how we want things to go. And what we're going to look at on that financial roadmap is revenues, expenses, and it's usually going to be for a year. Now, the thing with a budget is it is more than just the numbers. It's a planning and a decision-making tool. So this is where we sit down together and we really hammer out what we want the year ahead to look like. And one of the most important things is that we're using that budget to connect our mission and our programs to the financial resources that we have. So this financial power tool is going to help us to get to a place of financial sustainability. It's going to help us with our program planning. How much revenue do we have to run this program? Accountability. Each part of our organization is going to work together to make the whole organization better. And we want to make sure that when we say we've got a budget for a certain thing, that we're going to come back to that and say, how are we doing on that? And it's a hugely important communication tool. So we as the staff people are communicating to the board what we want to achieve in the next year. And the board is looking at it and saying, this makes sense to us, or could we maybe do this differently? So it's a communication tool between the staff and the board, but also between the executive director and the program managers, for example. And it's also something that we would be communicating to a foundation if they were interested in giving us a grant. But the biggest thing is that it's going to help us to make decisions. And all of those things combined make this a financial power tool that is going to help us to meet our mission. So when we're talking about a budget, usually what we're talking about is an operating budget. Where is the money going to come from? Where is it going to go? We could also be putting together a capital budget. So if we've got big projects that we're working on, we would be putting together a budget that was specific to that project. Let's say we're building a new building for our program. But usually when we talk budget, with nonprofits, what we're talking about is that operating budget. So what that budget is made up of is revenue, the funds that are going to come in, and expenses, the funds that are going to go out. And we're going to take those expenses and we're going to divide them out into our three categories: program expenses, administrative and general expenses, and fundraising expenses. The funds coming in and the funds going out, the difference between the two is an increase or a decrease to our net assets. If we were talking about a for-profit business, we would be calling that profit. But with a nonprofit, what we're looking at is an increase or decrease to our net assets. So let's break down the process of creating a budget. And when I'm working with a nonprofit to help them create a budget, they tend to look at it more like the end product. Like, you're going to help us with the end product. You're going to help us put the numbers into QuickBooks or a spreadsheet. But there's a whole lot that's got to happen before we get to putting the numbers in a spreadsheet. That's the easy part. That's just putting numbers in a spreadsheet. All of the stuff that goes before is what it takes to make a good budget. So we want to start with planning and goal setting. What is it that we want to achieve next year? What do we have for programs that we want to do more of? Or what do we have for new programs that we want to do? So we're going to sit down and we're going to look at each piece of the puzzle, the programs that we're running, for example, but we're also going to look at the organization as a whole, because we may have a big goal, like we want to build up a reserve this year. We want to do some capacity building because we want to bring on a new staff person. So it starts with the big picture, and then the big picture for each part of the organization, for each program or project we have going on. The next piece of it is we want to look at the revenue. And the revenue is always the tricky part for nonprofits. So we want to look at what are our current sources of revenue. If we're running a program, what are the sources of revenue for that program? If we have a project that we're working on, what are the sources of revenue we have for that right now? And as we're doing that, We're also looking at what are the chances that we're going to get this grant that we've applied for? Is it 10%? Is it 90%? Have we been told that we're probably going to get it? So maybe it's a 75%. So we have to always be thinking about that in terms of that volatility. Where are the funds coming from, and how sure are we of those funds? This also gives us a tool for our fundraising folks, because we can say we're going to have a shortfall, or we want to raise funds for the specific program. The next piece of it is to look at the expenses. So we think we've got this much coming in for revenue. How are we going to allocate those funds? What are the most important things that we need to spend money on? So if we're running a child care center, we want to make sure that we have people there to take care of the children, right? So the payroll for that is a really important expense. So what we're doing here is we're taking the resources that we think we're going to have, the revenue coming in, and we're saying, let's divide those revenues out in a way that makes the most sense and helps us to fulfill our mission in the best possible way. Once we've got those things nailed down, and that's the hard part, that is the time-consuming part right there, figuring all of that out. Once it's all put together and nicely in a spreadsheet or on QuickBooks or wherever you're keeping your budget, then we're going to go through a review and approval process. We want to make sure that we've thought things through, go through it again and say, did we cover all of our bases? And I would love it if you had a checklist where you said, these are our goals, and you went through and checked your budget against those goals. That would make me super happy, because then you're making sure that you're hitting all of those things that you said you needed to hit with your budget. From there, it's usually going to go to the finance committee or the board for approval. And then we're going to make sure that any changes get entered into our spreadsheet or our software. And then we're going to make sure that as we move along through the year, we're keeping track of how we're doing compared to our budget. That's the monitoring part. So we're going to look at our budget every month. We're going to look at our budget every quarter, every half year, every year, and we're going to see how we're doing compared to our budget. So those budget versus actual reports are extremely important, because what we're going to be able to see is we thought that this grant was going to come through and it didn't. So what does that do to our budget? We thought this grant was going to arrive on the first of the month, and now they're telling us it's going to be the third week of the month. So how does that change our picture? So we're just going to keep an eye on those things. And then we're going to look at those variances, and we're going to say, why are these different? We thought our payroll was going to be this much, but it's actually coming in higher because now we have to pay more to get labor. Or we were buying these supplies and the price of those supplies went way up. That gives us the opportunity to say, great, now what are we going to do about it? That's the corrective action part. We're going to shift funds from here to there, or we're going to cut back on this, or reach out to our stakeholders and say, listen, we've got this funding shortfall and we need your help. And then we're going to be running those reports on a regular basis. We're going to be communicating those things to people who are running our programs, or to our board, or to our grantors, or to our members, so that the people who need to know how we're doing have that information. Now, as we're creating our budgets, there are some best practices to consider. Being realistic is really a good idea, especially if we see changes in the national economy, the worldwide economy. We want to be looking at what the reality is. We don't want to be thinking, oh, this is going to be great, everything's going to work out perfectly. It probably isn't. We want to be realistic about the projections that we're making, and we need to be data driven when we're making those projections. What percent chance do we have of getting that grant? And be realistic and conservative. Like, oh, we're totally going to get that. We got that in the bag, only to find out that you don't. So being conservative about revenue, really a good idea. And being a little over on expenses, overestimating what you think it's going to be, is also a really good practice. One of the things that you don't want to do is just have somebody sit in an office and not talk to anybody about it and just create a budget, because you've got to have the input from people who are close to that program, or who are looking at the health of the organization as a whole. So those key staff members and board members need to be involved in that budgeting process. And it makes it clunkier than just being able to go in the office and come up with a bunch of numbers, but it makes it more accurate because you're talking to the people who are closest to what's going on. And then the other piece of this is building in those contingency funds. And one of your big goals for the year might be creating that contingency fund. If you're operating very close to the margins, you may not have that financial cushion. So maybe that's part of what you need to do is build that up. But one of the things that you can do, your board members can say, listen, we want to set up a certain amount of reserve funds. And then if you have a timing difference on a grant, for example, then you have some funds that you can draw against until those grant funds come in. I was talking to one of my friends once about budgeting, as one does. And she said, well, you can't budget for things like your stove and your refrigerator going out at the same time. And that's true. You can't necessarily know exactly what it is that's going to go wrong, but you know that something will go wrong. So you can always have that as part of your plan. Like, if something goes wrong, what are we going to do? So that's part of building in the contingency funds for those unexpected things. So also best practices, review and revise on the budget, especially if there are significant changes. So suddenly that federal grant that you thought you were going to get, you're no longer going to get. So that is a huge change in your budget. And now you've got to go back to the beginning and say, okay, where are we at right now? What is the reality of where we are and what are we going to do about it? And you always want to be aligning your budget with your strategic plan. So if part of your strategic plan is you want to add a staff member next year, then your budget needs to be working towards that. If part of your strategic plan is that you want to add a program because you've got an underserved part of your community, then your budget needs to align with that. And then the biggest thing is the communication part. Communicating while you're creating the budget, communicating after you've created the budget, communicating how the budget is doing versus what's actually going on, because your staff needs to know that, your board needs to know that, your stakeholders need to know that. And this also helps with transparency. This is exactly what we have planned to do with your money. Now, I mentioned budget volatility. Okay, nonprofit budgets are far more volatile than for-profit budgets. Generally speaking, we've already mentioned some things like a grant doesn't come in that you thought you were getting, or a grant comes in, but you get the funds 3 weeks later than you planned. Any number of things can happen. And I always say rule number 1 is stuff happens. And rule number 2 is be prepared for the stuff that's going to happen, even though you don't know what it is yet. It will come. So because that's such a big part of nonprofit budgets, I'm going to do a companion video about budget volatility, and I'll link that below. I hope that was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.